The man who sold the world a hamburger, the rise of Ray Kroc, and the building of McDonald's. Somewhere in the world, right now, a McDonald's is open. It doesn't matter what time it is, where you're sitting. On the other side of the planet, in Tokyo, in Johannesburg, in Sao Paulo, in Moscow, someone is ordering a burger, unwrapping a breakfast sandwich, or sipping a coffee under a pair of golden arches. Over 40,000 locations, more than 100 countries, billions of customers served every single year. McDonald's is not just a restaurant. It is infrastructure. It is a language. It is a symbol so deeply woven into the fabric of modern civilization that it has become one of the most recognized logos on Earth. More recognizable, some surveys suggest, than national flags. But here is what makes this story so extraordinary and so worth telling. It didn't begin with a visionary tech founder in Silicon Valley. It didn't start with inherited wealth, or a Harvard MBA, or a $1 billion investment round. It started with a 52-year-old salesman, a man who was broke, who had been grinding away at unremarkable jobs for 3 decades, who drove long distances to demo milkshake mixers to diner owners, and who had more behind him than ahead of him, at least. That's what anyone looking at him from the outside would have thought. His name was Ray Kroc, and what he did between 1954 and his death in 1984 is one of the most audacious, complicated, and transformative business stories in American history. This is not just a story about hamburgers. This is a story about obsession, about systems, about real estate, about betrayal, and about the relentless human belief that something ordinary, a burger, a shake, some fries can become extraordinary if you just refuse to stop pushing. This is the story of how Ray Kroc sold the world a hamburger, and in doing so, changed it forever. Early life and the long road to nowhere. Raymond Albert Kroc was born on the 5th of October, 1902, in Oak Park, Illinois, a tidy suburb just west of Chicago. His parents were Czech immigrants, people who believed in hard work, respectability, and the slow accumulation of a decent life. It was a perfectly ordinary American upbringing, in a perfectly ordinary time, in a perfectly ordinary place. Ray, however, was not ordinary, or at least he refused to believe he was. From a young age, he had a salesman's instincts, the ability to read a room, to charm a stranger, to find the angle in any conversation. He was restless in school, always more interested in the transaction than the lesson. At 15, he lied about his age and signed up as a Red Cross ambulance driver during World War I. The war ended before he ever shipped out, but the act itself tells you something about the man. Ray Kroc moved toward opportunity rather than waiting for it to arrive. After the war, he tried music. He played piano in jazz clubs, trying to turn a genuine talent into a career. It was a life he loved, but not one that paid the bills. So he pivoted to sales, a world that suited his temperament far better than any artistic pursuit. For years, Ray sold paper cups for the Lily Tulip Cup Company. It was steady work, unglamorous, but consistent. He was good at it. Better than good, he was exceptional. He understood how to build relationships, how to listen for a customer's real problem, and position his product as the solution. These were not lessons from a textbook. They were earned on the road, in greasy diners, and busy soda fountains, one handshake at a time. Then came the multi-mixer. In the late 1930s, Ray came across a machine capable of mixing 6 milkshakes simultaneously. He saw its potential immediately, not just as a product, but as a symbol of efficiency, faster service, happier customers, more revenue per hour. He became the exclusive distribution agent for the multi-mixer and spent the next decade and a half crisscrossing the United States, selling the machines to restaurants, diners, and drive-ins. It was a reasonable living, but barely. The post-war restaurant landscape was shifting. Drive-in culture was booming. Americans were moving to suburbs, buying cars, eating out more often. But they were also demanding something the restaurant industry hadn't quite figured out yet: speed, consistency, and value. The old model of the sit-down diner, with its sprawling menus and unpredictable wait times, was creaking under the weight of a new kind of American appetite. Ray Kroc was 52 years old, had a bad hip and early diabetes, and was still driving from town to town with a trunk full of milkshake machines. He had not yet done the thing that would define him. He was still waiting, though he wouldn't have called it that. He was still selling, still grinding, still convinced, somewhere deep in the engine of him, that the big thing was out there. And then, in 1954, he got a very unusual order. The discovery, San Bernardino, 1,954, a single restaurant in San Bernardino, California, had ordered 8 multi-mixers. 8. That meant the place was running 40 milkshake spindles simultaneously. For context, most diners might have 1 or 2. A large restaurant might have 3 or 4. 8 was almost absurd. What kind of operation needed 40 milkshake slots running at once? Ray had to see it. He drove to San Bernardino and found a small, clean, octagon-shaped building on a corner lot, surrounded by one of the longest lunch lines he had ever seen in his life. People were streaming in and out. The operation moved with a precision that felt almost mechanical. No car hops, no waitresses. You walked up to a window, you ordered from a limited menu burgers, fries, milkshakes, you paid, and within seconds, the food was in your hands. The men behind this operation were Richard and Maurice McDonald, brothers. They've been running restaurants in California since the 1940s, and after years of frustration with the inefficiencies of the traditional drive-in model, they had redesigned their entire kitchen from scratch in 1948. They called it the Speedy Service System. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Eliminate the menu clutter. Focus on a small number of items. Standardize every process. Design the kitchen like an assembly line so that any trained worker could produce the same item to the same quality in the same amount of time every single time. No guesswork, no variation, pure, repeatable efficiency. The results spoke for themselves. The San Bernardino McDonald's was doing business that should have been impossible for a restaurant its size. Families, workers, teenagers, they all came, and they kept coming because the food was cheap, it was fast, and it was always exactly what they expected. Ray Kroc stood in that parking lot and felt something shift inside him. Years later, he described the experience as a kind of electric revelation. Not a gentle idea forming in the background, a vision, sudden, complete, and overwhelming. He didn't just see a good restaurant, he saw a template. He saw something that could be replicated not once or twice, but hundreds of times, thousands of times, across every city, every suburb, every highway in America. He went inside, he introduced himself, he talked to the brothers. The McDonald's were pleasant men, successful, satisfied, and crucially, not particularly ambitious about expansion. They'd tried franchising before with limited results. They didn't want the headaches of managing franchisees across the country. They were happy with what they had. Ray Kroc was not a man who heard the word no and walked away. The vision, what Ray saw that the brothers didn't. To understand what Ray Kroc saw that day in San Bernardino, you have to understand the America of 1,954. The interstate highway system was being planned. Suburbs were exploding outward from every major city. The baby boom was creating millions of new families who needed fast, affordable meals on the go. Supermarkets were replacing corner stores. Everything was scaling up, standardizing, becoming national. America was becoming a country of brands. The McDonald brothers had built a perfect machine. Ray Kroc understood that the machine was only valuable if it could be duplicated. And he was perhaps the only person in that parking lot that day who had spent 30 years selling to restaurant owners across the country, who understood the landscape, who knew the hunger in the market, who had spent decades absorbing the rhythms and needs of the American food service industry. His pitch to the McDonald brothers was straightforward. Let me be your franchise agent. I will find operators. I will set up the locations. I will ensure quality. You will receive a percentage of every sale. You won't need to manage anything. You just let me do what I do. The agreement they signed in 1954 gave Ray Kroc the rights to franchise McDonald's restaurants across the United States. In exchange, the brothers would receive a small percentage of gross sales from each franchise, a number that, at the time, seemed generous to Ray and reasonable to them. What neither side fully grasped in that moment was just how large those numbers were eventually going to become. Ray returned to Illinois a changed man. He was not just selling milkshake machines anymore. He was going to build an empire. But empires are not built on enthusiasm alone. They require systems. And the first thing Ray Kroc did was study the McDonald brothers' system until he could reproduce it perfectly. He obsessed over every detail: the thickness of the patties, the precise amount of ketchup on each burger, the temperature of the fry oil, the way the shake machine was cleaned at the end of the night. To someone watching from the outside, this level of attention to a fast food operation might have seemed excessive, even eccentric. To Ray, it was the entire point. Consistency, he believed, was the most powerful promise a business could make to its customers. Walk into any McDonald's anywhere in the country, any day of the week, and get the same burger, same fries, same experience. That predictability, that reliability was not a small thing. It was, in his estimation, the foundation of a brand. He had seen how the restaurant industry worked. Quality varied wildly from location to location. One good diner could be a neighborhood institution. But the moment you opened a second location, the cracks started to show. Ray believed that most restaurant concepts failed to scale because they failed to systematize. The McDonald brothers had cracked that problem in one location. Ray's genius was recognizing that the system itself, not just the food, was the product worth selling, building the franchise model. In April 1955, Ray Kroc opened the first McDonald's franchise location under his new company, McDonald's System Inc. in Des Plaines, Illinois. He did not simply hand over the keys to a franchisee and move on. He ran it himself, at least at first, working the counter, watching every detail, documenting everything that worked and everything that didn't. This was the laboratory. This was where he proved the concept could travel. The challenge of franchising, and it is a challenge that destroys most franchise models, is the fundamental tension between control and scale. To grow quickly, you need to bring in outside operators. But the moment you rely on outside operators, you risk losing the consistency that made the original concept successful in the first place. Most franchise systems of the era resolve this tension by lowering their standards. Ray resolved it by refusing to lower them. His operations manual became legendary, a thick, detailed document that governed every aspect of running a McDonald's location, from how to greet customers, to the exact weight of a beef patty, to the proper way to store potatoes before frying. It was not a suggestion, it was the law. Franchise owners who signed with Ray Kroc understood, sometimes to their frustration, that they were not buying the freedom to run their restaurant however they liked. They were buying a system, a proven, tested, rigorously documented system. And they were expected to follow it with the same discipline that Ray himself brought to every element of the operation. He recruited franchise owners carefully. He was not looking for passive investors who wanted to clip coupons on someone else's labor. He wanted operators. People who would be physically present in their restaurants, who had skin in the game, who understood that the McDonald's experience their customers received was a direct reflection of their own daily effort. He also built what he would later call a three-legged stool, the interdependence of McDonald's Corporation, its franchise owners, and its suppliers. All three legs had to be strong for the stool to stand. If McDonald's extracted too much from franchisees, they would cut corners. If suppliers were squeezed on quality, customers would suffer. If franchisees were uncommitted, the brand would erode. The balance was everything. Suppliers were brought into this ecosystem with the same philosophy. Ray was not interested in the cheapest supplier. He was interested in the most consistent supplier. Companies that could deliver the same potato, the same bun, the same beef patty at scale, reliably, every single time. He worked with suppliers almost as partners, sharing information, aligning incentives, building relationships that would last decades. By the late 1950s, McDonald's was growing. Not explosively, not yet, but steadily, methodically, in the way that durable things grow. New locations were opening. Franchisees were reporting strong results. The golden arches, originally an architectural design element on the buildings themselves, were becoming a recognizable symbol. But Ray Kroc had a problem, a serious one, and solving it would require one of the most consequential business decisions in American corporate history, the critical business strategy. Real estate is the business. In the late 1950s, McDonald's was operationally successful, but financially precarious. Ray's original franchise agreement with the McDonald brothers meant he was operating on thin margins. He received a small percentage of each franchise's gross sales, but that revenue wasn't enough to fund aggressive national expansion, pay his staff, or provide the capital needed to build the infrastructure a growing company required. Despite the restaurant's popularity, Ray Kroc was, in a very real sense, running out of money. He needed a new financial model, and he found one in the most unlikely of places. A financial advisor named Harry Sonneborn walked into Ray's life at precisely the right moment. Sonneborn had a vision that was so simple, so clear, and so obviously right in hindsight that it's almost surprising no one had articulated it before. His insight was this: McDonald's should not think of itself primarily as a restaurant company. It should think of itself as a real estate company. Here was the logic. Instead of simply granting franchises and collecting royalties, McDonald's Corporation would identify the sites for new restaurants, negotiate leases on those properties, or purchase the land outright, and then sublease those locations to franchise operators at a markup. McDonald's would control the real estate, the franchisee would run the restaurant, and McDonald's would collect both a percentage of sales and a monthly rental payment. This changed everything. Suddenly, McDonald's had a secure, recurring revenue stream that was not solely dependent on the performance of any single franchise location. It had leverage over franchisees because if an operator underperformed or violated standards, McDonald's could simply not renew the lease. It had a growing portfolio of physical assets that would appreciate over time. And it had a powerful incentive for franchisees to maximize sales because higher sales meant McDonald's also earned more on its percentage. In 1956, Ray Kroc and Harry Sonneborn incorporated the Franchise Realty Corporation, the vehicle through which this strategy would be executed. They began acquiring land and signing leases at the sites of new McDonald's locations. In many cases, McDonald's would negotiate a long-term ground lease with a landlord, then sublease the property to the franchisee at double the rate, pocketing the difference while the restaurant bore the operational risk. This model was radical, and it worked with an almost breathtaking efficiency. Within a few years, Franchise Realty had accumulated a real estate portfolio that formed the bedrock of McDonald's financial power. When investors looked at the company, they weren't just seeing a fast food chain. They were seeing a real estate empire with a fast food operation sitting on top of it, generating reliable cash flows, backed by tangible physical assets, and positioned at some of the most valuable commercial corners in the United States. Ray Kroc later said, perhaps with some exaggeration, but more than a grain of truth, that he was not in the hamburger business. He was in the real estate business. The hamburgers were just the mechanism by which the real estate was financed. This insight that the business model sitting beneath the visible product is often the real source of power is one of the most instructive lessons in the entire McDonald's story. It is a lesson that modern technology companies, subscription businesses, and platform operators understand intuitively. But in the mid-1950s, in the context of fast food, it was genuinely revolutionary. Expansion and global growth. Ray Kroc had developed what amounted to a site selection science. McDonald's didn't open restaurants randomly. Location scouts, some of the earliest practitioners of what we now call geospatial business analysis, drove through growing suburbs, looking for the intersections of high traffic, high visibility, and untapped demand. They tracked residential density, nearby schools, competitor proximity, and income levels. And McDonald's was not placed. It was planted deliberately, strategically, in the spots most likely to generate maximum volume. In 1961, a significant turning point arrived. Ray Kroc had grown increasingly frustrated with the constraints of his original agreement with the McDonald brothers. He was running the national expansion. He was building the brand, but the brothers still owned the original name the trademark, and the right to grant their own franchises, including, controversially, a franchise in a Chicago suburb that competed directly with one of Ray's locations. He decided to buy them out completely. The price was $2.7 million, an enormous sum at the time, particularly given McDonald's thin finances. Ray was forced to raise the money through institutional borrowing, including a pivotal loan from a group of insurance companies. The deal was structured in a way that stretched Ray Kroc to the absolute limits of his financial capacity. But he got it done. With full ownership of the McDonald's name and trademark, there were no more constraints, no more divided authority. Ray Kroc was now, unambiguously, the man in charge of McDonald's future. The 1960s were a decade of acceleration. New menu items were introduced: the Filet-O-Fish in 1963, the Big Mac in 1968, testing the limits of the system's flexibility while maintaining its core efficiency. Ronald McDonald debuted as a marketing character, cementing the brand's relationship with children and families in a way that would create generational loyalty. The Happy Meal, though it came later, followed the same logic. Build attachment early, and customers will carry the brand through their entire lives. In 1965, McDonald's Corporation went public on the New York Stock Exchange. The IPO was a watershed moment, not just financially, but symbolically. McDonald's was no longer a collection of burger stands. It was a publicly traded American institution. The stock performed spectacularly, minting millionaires among those early franchise owners and investors who had believed in the model from the beginning. International expansion began in the late 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s. Canada and Puerto Rico came first, followed by Japan, where a local businessman named Den Fujita adapted the McDonald's model with remarkable success to the Japanese market, then Europe, then Latin America, then the Middle East. Each new market presented its own challenges, different food regulations, different cultural expectations, different tastes. McDonald's approach was to maintain the core system while making carefully selected local adaptations. The Makalu Tikki in India, teriyaki burgers in Japan, potato wedges in Australia. The core identity, fast, clean, consistent, familiar, remained intact. The packaging was adjusted for local tastes without compromising the model. By the time Ray Kroc died in January 1984, McDonald's had more than 7,500 locations worldwide and was generating revenues in the billions. The Golden Arches were among the most recognized symbols on the planet. The foundation he had laid would continue to support extraordinary growth in the decades that followed. By the turn of the millennium, McDonald's had crossed 25,000 locations. Today, that number sits above 40,000. Challenges and controversies. No story of this scale is clean, and Ray Kroc's story, for all its triumph, carries some chapters that are uncomfortable to examine. The relationship with Richard and Maurice McDonald ended badly. The brothers had expected, when they signed their original agreement and later accepted the buyout, a degree of dignity and gratitude in the arrangement. What they got instead was something more complex. After the 1961 buyout, Ray Kroc had agreed verbally, according to the brothers, that they would receive ongoing royalties from McDonald's sales for the rest of their lives. It was a gentleman's agreement, an acknowledgement of the role they had played in creating what he was now commercializing. That agreement, if it existed as the brothers described it, was never honored. Whether this constituted a genuine betrayal or a misunderstanding, depending on whose account you accept, it left Richard and Maurice McDonald with little financial participation in the empire their invention had made possible. Maurice McDonald died in 1971. Richard McDonald died in 1998. He had outlived Ray Kroc by 14 years, long enough to watch the company he co-founded become one of the most valuable brands in the world. He lived comfortably, but not lavishly, a sharp contrast to the fortunes generated by the system he and his brother had first imagined in that small San Bernardino kitchen. Ray Kroc himself was not a uniformly easy man to admire. He was driven to the point of ruthlessness, willing to break agreements when they inconvenienced him, and to squeeze every possible advantage from every negotiation. He clashed violently with franchisees who deviated from his standards, and his idea of standards sometimes extended beyond food quality into areas that felt more like control than quality assurance. His personal life was turbulent. He married 3 times. His first wife, Ethel, stayed home while he built his empire. They eventually divorced. He pursued his second wife, Jane Dobbins Green, with characteristic intensity, and later married Joan Beverly Smith, whom he had poached from a friend, a story that generated its own controversies. And as McDonald's grew into a global phenomenon, it attracted new kinds of criticism. Questions about nutrition, labor practices, environmental impact, and the cultural influence of American fast food on communities around the world. These were not criticisms that Ray Kroc had to fully reckon with in his lifetime. They came later, as the world became more attentive to the downstream effects of the industries it had built, but they are part of the complete story. None of this erases what Ray Kroc built, but it complicates the mythology, which is to say, it makes the story true rather than merely heroic. Legacy, what Ray Kroc actually built. Ray Kroc did not invent the hamburger. He did not invent the drive-in restaurant, or the assembly line kitchen, or the franchise model. He did not even invent McDonald's. What he did was something harder than invention. He took an existing idea and imagined what it could become if someone were willing to fight obsessively and relentlessly for its full realization. The business lessons embedded in the McDonald's story have been studied in classrooms and boardrooms for decades. They are worth naming clearly. First, the power of systems over individual talent. Ray Kroc built a company that did not depend on the brilliance of any one cook, or manager, or executive. It depended on a system, a set of documented, enforced, replicable processes that could produce consistent results regardless of who was executing them. This is not a romantic idea. It is, in fact, somewhat cold in its logic, but it is the engine of every scalable business in existence. Second, the alignment of incentives. The three-legged stool, McDonald's, franchisees, suppliers, worked because each party's success was genuinely tied to the others. Ray Kroc understood, perhaps intuitively, that a business model that extracts too aggressively from its partners eventually destroys itself. Sustainable scale requires sustainable relationships. Third, the separation of the visible product from the underlying business model. McDonald's customers buy hamburgers. McDonald's Corporation, as Harry Sonneborn helped Ray understand, is in the real estate and brand licensing business. The hamburgers are not incidental. They are the mechanism by which the real business is funded. Understanding the difference between what you sell and how you make money is not a technicality. It is often the difference between a business that survives and one that scales. Fourth, the underestimated power of consistency. In a world where novelty is constantly celebrated, there is a profound and underappreciated market for the reliable and the known. Ray Kroc believed and proved that millions of people would pay for the certainty of getting exactly what they expected every time without fail. It sounds simple. It is extraordinarily difficult to execute. And perhaps most fundamentally, the lesson that timing and tenacity are inseparable. Ray Kroc found McDonald's at exactly the right moment in American history. Suburban growth, car culture, rising disposable incomes, changing eating habits, the conditions were perfect. But conditions alone produce nothing. The history of American business is full of people who saw the right opportunity at the right time and failed to act with enough force or discipline to capture it. Ray acted relentlessly for 30 years. He was not a good man in all the ways we might wish the protagonists of great stories to be. He was complicated and sometimes cruel, and capable of the kind of ruthlessness that wins and wounds in equal measure. But he was also a man of extraordinary conviction, someone who looked at the world and refused to accept that it had already decided what his role in it would be. At 52, by most reasonable measures, his best days were behind him. He had no great fortune, no obvious destiny. He had a trunk full of milkshake mixers and a lifetime of unremarkable sales calls and a stubborn refusal to accept that the story was already over. He drove to San Bernardino, he stood in a parking lot, he ate a burger. And then he spent the rest of his life making sure that burger, in exactly that wrapper, at exactly that price, was available to every person in every town in every country on earth. That is the legacy of Ray Kroc, not the hamburger. The belief that something ordinary, done with extraordinary discipline, becomes something else entirely, something golden,